Here's another one of those truths that can absolutely change your life when you start seeing it clearly. And it's this: healing begins when fear loosens. And that sounds simple, but it's actually very deep because I think a lot of people assume that they are only dealing with the thing that they can see on the surface. They think that they're dealing with stress or pressure or a symptom, a bad habit, emotional pain, relationship problems, performance problems, overthinking, uncertainty, exhaustion, a hard season. And yes, those things may all be real, but many times underneath the surface problem is fear. That is the deeper light bulb moment. Fear of letting go, fear of changing, fear of trusting, fear of feeling, fear of losing control, fear of release, fear of being vulnerable, fear of losing an old identity, fear of what healing might require, fear of who you might become if you stop living the old way. And I think one of the reasons people stay stuck longer than they need to is because they keep trying to fix the outside while fear is still running the inside. And that is such an important thing to understand because when fear is still gripping the mind, the body, the story, the interpretation, and the way a person is relating to life, then even if they try to make changes on the outside, the whole system keeps getting pulled back towards the same suffering. That's why healing is not just fixing symptoms, it is releasing fear. That's a much deeper kind of healing. And I think many people don't realize how much fear is hidden underneath what they're struggling with. They just know they're stressed. They just know they're tired. They just know they keep doing the same thing. They just know they feel overwhelmed. They just know they can't seem to let go. They just know they keep tightening up and overthinking and reaching for the old habit or staying emotionally stuck. But often fear is the same, and it's there. It's the thing quietly holding the whole system together. And when fear stays in place, suffering often stays in place too. And that's the truth. I think this is one reason people can work so hard to change and still feel like something is not moving because they're trying to solve what's on the surface without addressing what's underneath. For example, somebody may think they have a stress problem. Maybe what is really happening is that fear is keeping their system activated. Fear of what will happen, fear of what they do not know yet, fear of making the wrong move, fear of not staying ahead, fear of letting something fall apart, fear of not being enough, fear of not being in control. And that matters because the person is not only stressed by life, they are stressed by fear's interpretation of life. And that is a very different thing. Or somebody may think they have a habit problem, but underneath the habit is fear of being or feeling discomfort, fear of being with themselves, fear of not having the quick comfort, fear of what comes up when they stop numbing, fear of change, fear of who they are without the old pattern. And that matters too, because now the habit is not just about behavior, it is about what fear is trying to avoid. And I think this is why fear can be so sneaky. It doesn't always show up looking dramatic. Sometimes it looks like control, and sometimes like overthinking, and sometimes like pressure, and sometimes like perfectionism, sometimes like staying busy, and sometimes like needing answers right now, and sometimes like being hard on yourself, and sometimes like clinging to what hurts you because at least it feels familiar. And that is one of the biggest things I wish more people understood. Fear does not always look like panic. Sometimes it looks like the entire way a person has learned to operate. And because it has been there for so long, they stop calling it fear. They probably never even called it fear to begin with. They call it my personality, my way, my standards, my drive, my coping, my reality, my truth, my habit, my normal. But just because something has become normal does not mean it is not fear-based. And that is very important because a lot of people are living inside fear patterns that become so familiar they no longer recognize them as fear. Again, if they even ever recognize them as fear to begin with. And that is why awareness matters so much. You have to start being willing to ask, what fear might be underneath this? Underneath the stress, underneath the habit, underneath the tightness, underneath the need to control, underneath the pressure, underneath the overthinking, underneath the emotional reaction, underneath the inability to let go. That question can open up so much, because once you recognize fear, now you are not just fighting the symptom anymore. Now you are looking at the real force that has been sustaining it. And I think this is also why many people are more afraid of healing than they realize. And that's a big one. People will say they want peace, they want freedom, they want healing, they want change, they want relief. And consciously, I believe they do. But part of them is also afraid of what healing will require, afraid of what letting go will feel like, afraid of not having the old pattern anymore, afraid of not being able to rely on the same defenses, afraid of feeling what was buried underneath for so long, afraid of becoming someone different, afraid of no longer having the old identity to stand in. And that is real. And I think if people don't understand that, they can become very hard on themselves. They can think, why do I keep going back? Why do I keep holding on? Why do I keep doing this? Why do I keep getting stuck here? And sometimes the answer is not because you don't want healing. Sometimes the answer is because fear is still gripping you. Fear is still making the old way feel safer than the new way. And that is why healing has to happen at the level of thought too, because fear is not just in the symptoms. It is in the interpretation. It's in the story. It's in what the mind is saying. It's in what the person believes this means. It's in the conclusions they are drawing. It's in the way they see themselves, their life, other people, and what is possible. And that is why real healing changes how a person sees and thinks and interprets and relates, not just what they do. And I think that is one of the most beautiful parts of deeper healing. When fear starts losing, when fear starts loosening, then everything starts changing. Not because life becomes perfect overnight, but because the grip is different. The same situation does not feel the same. The same trigger does not land the same. The same pattern does not pull as hard. The same discomfort does not control as much. The same uncertainty does not create the same level of panic. And that matters, because healing is not always instantly visible on the outside. Sometimes it begins as a loosening, a little less gripping, a little less obeying fear, a little less urgency, a little less need to control everything, a little more ability to pause, a little more truth, a little more room, a little more openness, a little more willingness to not make fear the final authority. That is healing too. And I think a lot of people miss their own progress because they imagine healing has to look dramatic. They imagine it has to be, I no longer struggle, or I no longer feel anything hard, or I never get triggered, or I never go back to old patterns. I'm just completely different now. But often, real healing begins much more quietly. It begins when fear loosens a little of the ground. It loses a little bit of the ground. When somebody pauses before reacting, when somebody notices the fear sooner, when somebody stops feeding the spiral so quickly, when somebody lets go sooner, when somebody stops making every hard thing a disaster, when somebody becomes willing to soften instead of brace, that is not small, that is real. And I think this is especially important for high achievers, strong people, responsible people, and people who are used to holding everything together, because those people often have fear hidden under very polished surfaces. Fear hidden under productivity, fear hidden under discipline, fear hidden under control, fear hidden under being the one who always manages everything, fear hidden under perfectionism, fear hidden under constant responsibility. And because looks so functional, they don't always question it. But if it's costing peace, if it's costing freedom, if it's costing health and costing joy and costing connection, costing higher performance, then it deserves to be looked at honestly. Because fear driven functioning may get results for a little while, but it comes at a price. And that is true across so many categories of life. In wellness, fear can hide underneath control or restriction in the whole emotional relationship with food and body. In performance, fear can hide underneath pressure, mechanics obsession, mistrust, over control, and the inability to recover. In stress free living, fear can hide underneath overthinking and urgency and over responsibility and the need to predict everything. In relationships, fear can hide underneath defensiveness and clinging and withdrawal and people pleasing and the inability to relax into connection. And that is why this theme is so broad and is so important, because a lot of suffering stays because fear stays. And when fear loosens, life changes. So, how do we work with this in a practical way? I think the first step is tell the truth about fear, not the dramatic version, the honest version. Now, ask yourself, what am I afraid of here? What am I afraid would happen if I let go? What am I afraid would happen if I trusted more? What am I afraid would happen if I stopped doing this the old way? What am I afraid would happen if I really started to heal? Those questions can be incredibly revealing. So the second step is separate the surface issue from the deeper issue. Maybe the surface issue is stress, but what is the fear underneath the stress? Maybe the surface issue is the habit, but what is the fear underneath the habit? Maybe the surface issue is control, but what is the fear underneath the control? And that matters, because once you find the deeper issue, now you stop fighting only the symptom. And the third step is notice how fear is shaping your interpretation. Fear makes things feel bigger, louder, more dangerous, more urgent, more personal, more final. Fear interprets. And that means when you are activated, it helps to then ask, is fear giving this more meaning than it deserves? Is fear making this feel bigger than it is? Is fear trying to convince me that gripping is safer than softening? And that is such a useful question. So the fourth step is loosen one grip, not all of them, just one. One fear-based thought, one pressure pattern, one urge to over control, one moment of overthinking, one old story, one emotional habit. Just loosen one grip, because healing starts there, not in becoming instantly fearless, but in becoming less obedient to fear. And then the fifth step is practice a different inner response, a slower breath, a softer jaw, a pause, a more truthful thought, a decision not to escalate the story, a willingness to not make fear the boss of this moment. And that matters, because what you practice grows. And if you begin practicing less fear and more truth, less gripping and more openness, less panic and more presence, the whole inner system starts changing. And that is healing. So if I were to leave you with one thing today, it would be this. A lot of people are trying to heal the outside while the fear is still running the inside. And that is why things can stay such longer and they can feel stuck so much longer than they need to, because healing is not just about fixing the visible thing. It's about what happens when fear starts losing its grip. And that is when the mind opens. That is when the body softens. That is when interpretation changes. That is when peace becomes possible. That is when patterns begin to shift. That is when life starts moving differently. Healing begins when fear loosens. So maybe the question this week is not only, what do I want to heal? Maybe it's also, where is fear still gripping me? What is fear still making me hold on to? And what would it look like to loosen just a little? And that is where so much real change begins. Not in force, not in pretending, not in perfection, in loosening. And when fear loosens, healing can finally move. So I'd love to help you with this. Go to dawngrant.com to check out my products and services because I truly would love to help you with all this. I'll see you in there.